What would you do if your husband found the group chat where you mocked him, then didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't even explain himself, just went silent while building a case to erase you from his life? What if the first words you heard from him afterward came from a lawyer instead of him? I told myself it was harmless, the kind of joke friends laughed about before moving on, the kind of thing nobody outside the group chat would ever see. One evening, after work, I typed a message about Adrian, teased him in front of Emily and a few others, wrote something thoughtless that made everyone send laughing emojis back at once. I giggled when I hit send because it felt funny in the moment, because it didn't feel real or serious or mean. But then Adrian read it, scrolled through every word, every reaction, every inside joke I thought would stay private. He didn't say anything, didn't ask for an explanation, didn't slam a door or shout. He just closed the screen, looked at me once like he didn't even recognize me anymore, and stopped talking to me completely. The night Adrian saw the messages started like any other. Sophie was upstairs working on a school project. I was on the couch scrolling through my phone, and Adrian sat across from me with his laptop open, finishing some work reports. I didn't even notice when he set the computer aside and asked to borrow my phone for a moment because his had died. I handed it over without thinking, expecting nothing more than a quick search or maybe a call he needed to return. A few minutes later, he stopped scrolling, his expression unreadable as he stared at the screen. I asked if something was wrong, but he didn't answer. He just kept looking at the messages while I felt my stomach start to twist. The group chat wasn't serious. At least that was what I told myself. It was me, Emily, and two of my co-workers from the clinic. Earlier that day, during my lunch break, someone had asked if Adrian ever got jealous about the men at my workplace gym, and I had laughed, saying he didn't have a reason to with his tiny tool. It was supposed to be a joke, a throwaway comment, nothing cruel or permanent. Emily had sent a string of laughing emojis, someone else replied with a meme, and I thought that was the end of it. But Adrian was reading every single line now, every stupid joke that had seemed harmless at the time. I tried to explain, said it was nothing serious, just silly talk to pass the time, but he didn't respond. He didn't even look at me. He set the phone on the table like it suddenly weighed too much and went upstairs without a word. I followed him, asking if he was angry, saying he was being dramatic, telling him everyone made jokes like that sometimes. He opened the closet, pulled out a small overnight bag, and started packing shirts in the same calm, precise way he always did before business trips. I asked where he was going, but he didn't answer. He didn't slam drawers or shove things carelessly into the bag. He folded each item neatly, zipped the bag slowly, and walked past me toward the stairs. Sophie peeked out of her room when she heard movement, asking if Dad was leaving. I told her he just needed some air, that everything was fine, that grown-ups got stressed sometimes and needed a break. My voice sounded too bright, too fake, even to me. Adrian grabbed his car keys, slipped on his shoes, and left without looking back. The front door closed softly, almost politely, and the sound felt heavier than any shouting would have. I called Emily right after he left, my words tumbling over each other as I told her Adrian had read everything, that he wasn't speaking to me, that he had just packed a bag and walked out. She asked why I wrote it in the first place, and I said it was a joke, nothing more, that he was overreacting. She didn't disagree exactly, but she didn't defend me either. She just said maybe I should give him time to cool off before talking to him again. Marion called the next morning after Sophie told her Adrian hadn't come home. Her voice was tight as she asked if it was true that I had mocked him in front of other people. I said it wasn't like that it had just been one silly comment in a private chat, but she said nothing was private anymore. Not when people shared screenshots and gossip traveled faster than the truth. I asked if Adrian was with her, and she said yes, that he was staying in her guest room for now. At work that afternoon, two of my co-workers whispered near the break room door, their voices dropping when I walked past. I knew they had seen the chat too, or at least heard about it. My cheeks burned as I made coffee, pretending not to notice the glances they exchanged when I turned my back. When I told Emily about it later, she said people love drama, that gossip always made things worse, that the best thing I could do was talk to Adrian directly and fix this before it grew bigger. I told her he wasn't answering my calls, that he had barely spoken to Sophie when she asked if he was coming home. Emily said maybe he needed space, but I hated that word because it felt like the kind of thing people asked for before making decisions they didn't plan to take back. That evening, I drove to Marian's house. Adrian's car was in the driveway. Through the front window, I saw him at the dining table with papers spread out in front of him. He wasn't reading them like bills or work files. He was organizing them into neat piles, tapping each one square before moving on to the next. Marian brought him a cup of tea and said something that made him nod once without looking up. I stood there on the sidewalk for a long moment before getting back into my car without knocking. When I got home, Sophie asked if Dad was coming back soon. I told her yes automatically, then realized I didn't actually know. He hadn't said anything to me directly since the night he left. He hadn't argued, hadn't asked for explanations, hadn't even told me what he was thinking. It was like the silence itself was his answer, like he was letting it spread through the house one room at a time until there was nothing left but the space he used to fill. Before bed, I called Emily again, my voice sharp this time, as I said he was taking things too far, that anyone else would have laughed it off after a day or two. She said maybe Adrian wasn't like anyone else, that some people didn't shout or break things when they were hurt. Some people just got very quiet while they decided what to do next. I told her she was wrong, that he was just trying to scare me into apologizing. But as I hung up, I couldn't shake the image of him at Marian's dining table, calmly sorting papers into piles I couldn't name. The next few days felt like living inside someone else's life. Adrian didn't call, didn't come by the house except once to drop off a bag of groceries for Sophie, and even then, he barely looked at me. He stood in the doorway asking Sophie about school, listening as she told him about a spelling test, his voice warm only when he spoke to her. With me, there was nothing. No anger, no questions, not even small talk. When she asked if he was coming home soon, he told her he was staying at Grandma Marian's for a while, but would see her every day after work. Then he left, before I could say anything at all. I told myself this was temporary, that he just needed to cool off, that once things settled, he would come back and we would talk. But on Wednesday morning, Emily called after hearing from a neighbor that Adrian had been seen downtown near the courthouse cafe, meeting someone in a suit. She said people were starting to ask questions, that gossip had already started spreading through Marian's side of the family. I told her he probably needed advice about something at work, maybe taxes, maybe the house, practical things he always handled early, so they didn't pile up later. Emily didn't sound convinced. That afternoon, 2 women at the clinic stopped talking when I walked into the staff room. They looked at me for a second before asking casually if everything at home was all right. I smiled like nothing was wrong. Told them Adrian was staying with his mother for a few days because she wasn't feeling well. They nodded slowly, the way people do when they already know the real story but want to hear you say it out loud. One of them said she heard about the messages, her voice careful but curious. I told them people love to exaggerate, that it was just a dumb joke taken out of context. They exchanged a glance and changed the subject, but I could feel their judgment even after I left the room. That evening, I drove to Marian's house again. Adrian's car was parked in the driveway like before, and through the window, I saw him sitting at the dining table with the same man in the suit Emily had mentioned. Papers were spread out between them, neat stacks with colored tabs, the kind of folders lawyers carried in court dramas on television. Marian moved around the kitchen like she had company over for dinner instead of whatever this was. Adrian wasn't frowning, wasn't angry. He just looked focused, calm, like a man going through instructions for something already decided. I didn't knock this time either. I drove home with the steering wheel slippery under my hands and called Emily as soon as I got inside. She asked if I had talked to Adrian yet, and when I told her about the man in the suit, she asked slowly if I was sure he wasn't a lawyer. I said that was ridiculous, that Adrian wouldn't talk to a lawyer without saying something to me first. She didn't argue, but she didn't agree either, and I hated the way her silence felt heavier than her words. On Thursday morning, Marian called to ask if Sophie could stay with her over the weekend, because Adrian wanted to take her to the park and maybe to his mother's church on Sunday. She said it like a courtesy instead of a request, like the decision had already been made. I told her Sophie had homework, but she said Adrian had already spoken to Sophie's teacher about getting assignments early. It was the first time I realized he might be planning things without me, whole pieces of life arranged neatly on his side, while mine stayed messy and uncertain. At work that day, I overheard two patients in the waiting room whispering about a family situation they had seen on Facebook. Someone hinting about divorce, about custody, about a husband getting legal advice after his wife embarrassed him in public. My chest went cold before I realized they were talking about us. I asked Emily if Marian had been posting things online, and she said no, but people didn't need much to start filling in details on their own. That night, Adrian came by the house again while Sophie was finishing her dinner. He brought her a new set of markers for school, helped her pack a small overnight bag, and told her he would pick her up early Saturday morning. He spoke to her gently, smiled when she showed him a picture she had drawn, told her they would get ice cream after the park. With me, there was nothing. No explanation, no conversation, just the quiet movement of him gathering Sophie's things before leaving again. After the door closed, I called Emily and told her this had gone far enough. I said Adrian was being cold on purpose, that he was trying to make me look like the villain in front of everyone, that Marian was enjoying every second of it. Emily asked what exactly I thought he was planning. I told her he was just angry, that he wanted to scare me before coming home, like nothing happened. She asked if I was sure this was anger, if maybe it was something else entirely. I didn't answer, because when I thought about the folders on the table at Marian's house, the meetings downtown, the way he was arranging weekends with Sophie without talking to me first, anger didn't feel like the right word anymore. It felt like something colder, quieter, and much harder to stop. By the weekend, Marian decided to host a family dinner, claiming it was to keep things normal, though everyone knew it was her way of showing whose side she was on. She called Friday afternoon to invite Sophie directly, not even asking me first, saying Adrian would pick us both up at 6 so there wouldn't be any confusion. I told Emily it was ridiculous, that Marian was using this dinner to parade me in front of the family like some villain from one of her church gossip circles. Emily said maybe it was a chance to talk things through, but her voice didn't sound convinced. Adrian arrived on time, polite but distant as always. He greeted Sophie warmly, asked if she was excited to see her cousins, then opened the car door for her before walking back to the driver's side without looking at me. During the ride, he spoke only to Sophie, asking about school projects, what books she was reading, whether she still wanted to sign up for soccer in the spring. With me, there was only silence, not sharp or angry, just blank, like we were strangers sharing the same space for convenience. At Marian's house, the whole family was already gathered. Cousins, aunts, uncles. They all greeted Adrian first, Sophie second, and me last with polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. I could feel the judgment rolling off them in waves, though no one said anything directly. The group chat incident had traveled faster than I expected. Bits and pieces whispered from one relative to another, until everyone thought they knew the whole story. Dinner started stiff and quiet. Marian passed the potatoes, asked Sophie about school, complimented Adrian on some work project she claimed to have read about in the paper. When she finally turned to me, she asked how things were at the clinic, her voice carrying the kind of politeness that cut sharper than open insults. I said work was fine, busy as usual, pretending I didn't hear the cousin at the far end murmur something about Facebook posts to the aunt beside him. Halfway through the meal, one of Adrian's uncles joked about husbands needing thick skin in modern marriages, his tone light, but his eyes sliding toward me like everyone understood the punchline. A few people laughed awkwardly, before Marian set her fork down sharply and said some things stop being funny when families get dragged into public embarrassment. The table went quiet after that. Adrian didn't say a word, just kept eating like the conversation had nothing to do with him. I tried to defend myself, said people were exaggerating, that it was one stupid comment in a private chat, that everyone needed to calm down before turning it into something bigger than it was. Marion looked at me for a long moment before saying Adrian had every right to protect himself when respect inside a marriage disappeared. A few relatives nodded while others looked away, like they didn't want to get caught agreeing with her too openly. Emily finally spoke up, saying maybe everyone should stop acting like one message defined an entire marriage. I expected her to keep defending me, but instead she added softly that Adrian had been meeting with someone downtown, that people were saying words like custody and separation, and maybe this dinner wasn't the place to pretend nothing was happening. I stared at her, furious she would bring that up here, in front of Marion and the cousins, and everyone else waiting to see cracks spread wider across the table. Marion didn't look surprised. She just asked Adrian calmly if everything was moving along as planned, and he nodded once without offering details. After dinner, the relatives gathered in small groups, whispering in corners, while Sophie played with her cousins in the living room. Emily pulled me aside near the coat rack, her face tight as she said she had heard from a friend who worked at the courthouse that Adrian had opened a separate bank account earlier in the week. She asked if he had told me anything about it. I said no because he hadn't told me anything at all since the night he left. When I confronted Marion, she didn't deny it. She said Adrian was getting his affairs in order, that he wanted everything neat and documented so there would be no confusion later. I asked what she meant by later, but she just told me to speak to Adrian directly. He, of course, was nowhere nearby by then, busy helping Sophie gather her things for the ride home, like the rest of us didn't exist. On the way back, Adrian dropped Sophie and me at the house without coming inside. He told Sophie he would see her Sunday for church, then waited until she was safely on the porch before driving away. I watched the taillights disappear down the street, my hands shaking even though the night wasn't that cold. Inside, Sophie asked why everyone at dinner seemed so serious, why Grandma kept looking at me like she was angry, why Dad wasn't staying with us tonight. I told her people were overreacting, that things would settle down soon, that her father was just stressed from work. She didn't look convinced. When I called Emily later, she asked if I was beginning to understand that this wasn't about space or cooling off anymore. She said men didn't open new bank accounts, meet lawyers downtown, and gather paperwork just to scare their wives into apologizing. They did it because they were planning for something bigger, something final. I told her she was wrong, that Adrian would come to his senses once this gossip died down, once people stopped fueling the fire. But even as I said it, I kept seeing Marion's face at the dinner table, calm and certain, like she already knew exactly where this was headed while I was still pretending not to. The following week felt like watching someone quietly dismantle my life, while I kept telling everyone it wasn't happening. Adrian still didn't come home, though he stopped by twice to see Sophie. He brought her a new backpack for school, helped her finish a science project at the kitchen table, and spoke to her with the same calm warmth he always had. With me, there was nothing. No small talk, no irritation, no sign of anger even. Just polite distance, like I was a stranger renting space in the same house. On Tuesday morning, Emily called after driving past Marion's house. She said Adrian's car was there again, parked beside one she didn't recognize. A dark sedan, with a law firm's logo on the door. She said it looked like he was meeting someone inside, because Marion's curtains were open, and she saw papers spread across the dining table. I told her it didn't mean anything, that he was probably sorting out insurance or taxes, things he always handled early every year. Emily didn't argue, but she didn't agree either. That afternoon, Marion came by to drop off some of Sophie's things she claimed had been left at her house. She stayed long enough to mention, in that careful voice of hers, that Adrian was working with a professional now to make sure everything was clear and fair moving forward. I asked fair for what, but she said Adrian would explain when the time was right. Then she left before I could press her further, like she had delivered a message and nothing more. At work, the whispers had started again. One of my co-workers asked if I was doing all right, her voice carrying that mix of curiosity and pity people used when they already knew the answer. I told her everything was fine, that people were exaggerating, that Adrian was just staying with Marion until things settled down. She nodded slowly like she didn't believe me and changed the subject, but the look on her face stayed with me for the rest of the day. On Thursday evening, Adrian came by the house again, this time with a man I didn't know. He introduced him to Sophie as Mr. Morton, said he was helping with family paperwork, and asked Sophie to show him her drawings while they talked in the kitchen. I stood there frozen while Adrian spread documents across the table, pointing at different sections, while Mr. Morton explained things in a low, even voice. I demanded to know what was going on, but Adrian said calmly that everything would be handled properly, that there was no reason for arguments or confusion later. He didn't raise his voice, didn't look angry. He just kept signing pages while I stood there asking if this was about money, about the house, about Sophie. He said I would see everything clearly soon enough. After they left, I called Emily in a panic, telling her Adrian was bringing lawyers into our house now, that he was planning something behind my back. She asked if I was surprised after everything I had seen already. The meetings downtown, the bank accounts, the family dinner where Marion practically spelled it out for me. I said he was trying to scare me, that this was some kind of performance to make me feel guilty. Emily was quiet for a long moment before saying, maybe guilt wasn't the point anymore. On Friday, a courier delivered a sealed envelope to the house with Adrian's name in the corner. I didn't open it right away, pacing the kitchen instead, telling myself it was probably bank paperwork or tax forms, nothing important. But deep down, I already knew it wasn't. That evening, Adrian came by to pick up Sophie for the weekend. He packed her bag himself, making sure she had school clothes for Monday, and the book she was reading for class. He told her they were going to the park, maybe to a movie afterward, then back to Marion's for the night. With me, he exchanged only a few polite sentences about what time he would bring her home on Sunday. When I asked about the envelope, he said everything inside was official, that I should read it carefully when I was ready. I told him this was ridiculous, that couples argued and moved on all the time, that people didn't end marriages over one mistake. He didn't argue back. He just told Sophie to get her coat and left with the envelope still sitting unopened on the counter. Emily came over later and read it with me. It wasn't just bank forms. It was a notice about legal representation, about custody arrangements being drafted, about property evaluations scheduled for the next month. Everything written in calm professional language, with dates already set like this, had been planned step by step, while I was still telling everyone it was temporary. I told Emily he was moving too fast, that this was all because Marion had pushed him into it, that she had been waiting for a reason to turn him against me. Emily didn't answer right away. Then she said maybe nobody had to push Adrian anywhere. Maybe he had decided all on his own after I handed him the reason in that group chat for the whole world to laugh at. That night the house felt too big, too quiet, like the walls themselves knew something was ending even while I kept pretending it wasn't. Sophie's backpack was gone for the weekend. Adrian's voice had been calm the entire time, and the envelope on the counter felt heavier every time I looked at it. It was the first time I wondered if Emily was right, if maybe this wasn't anger or punishment at all. Maybe it was preparation, neat and methodical, for a life that wouldn't have me in it anymore. The following Tuesday, the second envelope came, this time delivered by a man in a dark coat who asked for me by name. He handed it over politely, like he was bringing bills or flyers, but the weight of it told me different before I even opened it. Inside were divorce filings, custody proposals, financial statements, and dates already scheduled for hearings. Each page had neat sections, typed labels, and Adrian's name signed in 3 different places. It didn't look rushed or emotional. It looked like something prepared carefully over weeks, while I was still telling everyone this was temporary. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the papers until Sophie came home from school. I shoved them into a drawer before she could see them, smiling too brightly as she told me about a spelling test and what she wanted for dinner. I kept nodding at the right times, my chest tight the whole evening, the drawer feeling louder than anything else in the house. Adrian came by after dinner to bring Sophie a new jacket Marion had bought her. He talked with Sophie about her homework, asked if she was ready for the school field trip next week, and said he would take her shopping for shoes on Saturday. I waited until Sophie went upstairs before holding the envelope out to him and demanding to know if this was a joke. Adrian looked at me the way people look at strangers asking for directions, calm, polite, completely steady. He said it wasn't a joke. He said everything inside was legal, proper, and already filed with the court. His voice didn't rise once. It didn't even sound cold, just final. Like he had stepped so far past anger, there was nothing left but paperwork and signatures. I told him he was throwing away 12 years of marriage over one stupid comment in a group chat. He said it wasn't about one comment. Then he told me Sophie would stay with him at Marion's house for the weekend because the court recommended temporary custody schedules during proceedings. After he left, I called Emily. My voice shook as I told her he was serious, that he was actually filing for divorce, that he was using lawyers and custody plans like we were enemies in some courtroom drama. Emily didn't speak for a long time before finally asking what I thought would happen after everything that had unfolded these past weeks. The meetings downtown, the envelopes, the bank accounts, the silence that had lasted longer than any fight ever could. I said he was being dramatic, that marriages survived worse, that people forgave bigger mistakes every single day. Emily asked if I had noticed how organized this all was, how there hadn't been a single outburst from Adrian since the night he left. She said men didn't stay this calm unless they were certain about what came next. On Thursday, Marion stopped by the clinic where I worked to drop off papers Adrian had signed for Sophie's school. She handed them to me in front of the receptionist desk, her voice polite, but carrying the weight of someone who had already chosen a side. She said Adrian only wanted what was fair for Sophie and himself. Nothing messy, nothing cruel, just a clean end so everyone could move on. I told her she had pushed him into this, that she had been waiting for a reason to get rid of me since the day we married. Marion didn't argue. She just said Adrian didn't need anyone to push him anywhere. Then she left before I could say another word. That evening, Emily came over and read through the papers with me. She pointed out the custody schedule, the financial disclosures, the plans for dividing property and savings into separate accounts. Everything was so neat, so thorough, like Adrian had walked through our entire life with a pen and ruler, drawing lines between what used to be ours and what would soon be his. I told Emily I could fight this, that courts didn't just hand everything to husbands because they filed first. She said I could fight if I wanted to, but looking at the pages spread across the table, even she sounded unsure about what good it would do. When Sophie came back downstairs, asking if Dad was picking her up Saturday morning, I said yes, before realizing Adrian hadn't actually asked my permission this time. He had told me, the same way the papers told me everything else now, quietly, officially, without room for discussion. The court date came 2 weeks later, on a grey, windless morning that felt too still for everything about to happen. Emily drove me because she said I shouldn't go alone, though she didn't promise it would make anything easier. Adrian arrived right on time with his lawyer, Charles Morton, carrying that same black folder I'd seen so many times at Marion's dining table. Marion walked in behind them like someone who already knew the ending of a story everyone else was just starting to read. Sophie stayed home with a neighbor because Adrian said she didn't need to see any of this, and for once I didn't argue. Inside the courtroom, the judge read through everything slowly, page by page, while Adrian stood calm and steady beside Charles. Divorce petition, custody schedule, financial disclosures, property division. It was all there in precise order, signed, dated, notarized. The timeline left no gaps, no space for questions or delays. When the judge asked if there were any disputes about the evidence, I didn't know what to say because every document was correct. The bank accounts Adrian had opened, the custody plans drafted with Sophie's school schedule attached, the witness statements from neighbors who saw him leave the night he found the group chat messages and never come back. Adrian didn't look at me while any of it was read aloud. He didn't look at Emily or Marion or anyone else either. When the judge asked if he had anything to add, Adrian simply said he wanted stability for Sophie, a clean resolution, and no drawn-out fights that would drag her through unnecessary chaos. His voice never shook, never rose, never carried even a trace of anger. It was like he had burned through every feeling weeks ago and left only this calm precision behind. When it was my turn, I told the judge this had all started with one stupid joke, that marriages had survived worse, that Adrian was overreacting because Marion had turned him against me. The judge asked if I had any evidence to dispute the records Adrian provided, and I didn't because there was nothing to dispute. He had arranged everything so carefully, there was no room left for arguments, no empty spaces for me to fill with excuses or explanations. Emily shifted beside me when the custody plan was read aloud. Sophie would live with Adrian during the school week, with alternating weekends assigned to me, and holidays divided clearly, so there would be no confusion later. The house would stay with Adrian, along with most of the savings and investments, while I would receive a small settlement spelled out in exact numbers on the last page of the packet. The judge asked if I understood the terms, and I said yes because there was nothing else to say, nothing left to fight for now that everything was already decided in ink. When the gavel finally came down, Adrian shook his lawyer's hand, gathered the folder, and left the courtroom with Marion walking close behind him. He didn't speak to me, didn't pause, didn't look back even once. Emily stayed beside me while I sat on the bench, holding the final papers, listening to their footsteps fading down the hallway until the building went quiet again. I told Emily this wasn't fair, that he had planned everything in silence while I was still waiting for him to come home and talk to me. She said maybe he had already finished with this marriage long before I understood what was happening, that some people didn't end things with fights and shouting. They ended them with signatures, dates, and doors closing softly behind them. Outside the courthouse, Adrian's car pulled away with Marion in the passenger seat, Charles in the back, and the black folder on his lap like unfinished business, even though everything was already over. He didn't look at me standing on the steps, didn't slow down, didn't leave space for any last words. By the time Emily and I walked back to her car, the parking lot was nearly empty. The whole morning sealed into a stack of papers I held against my chest because I didn't know what else to do with them. Adrian had ended 12 years of marriage without yelling, without arguing, without a single chance for me to undo any of it. It was finished exactly the way he wanted, while I was still trying to understand how fast it had all disappeared. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.